I was one of the people who were headhunted by DC, which they were doing in the late 80s and 90s. And they used to have a big party every year, DC in London, where they invited all the British creators, and wined and dined us and everything. It was great. All these artists are saying, why are they doing it? Because they've never had this kind treatment from publishers before, they've always just been used. And here the publishers feeding them nice food and giving them free drinks, and they all ended up getting completely slashed. There were bodies found in the street outside later, totally unconscious because of alcohol. There's food being thrown about and everything. I sort of missed it because I wasn't invited.
Hey everyone, I'm Billy and welcome back to Half the Picture. I'm so pleased to say that our guests this episode are comic book power couple Bryan and Mary Talbot, whose comics include Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, Sally Heathcote's Suffragette, Rain. There are so many. Bryan initially came on the podcast to talk about the Casebook of Stamford Hawksmoor, his new comic, which is a prequel to his best-selling Grandville series of comic books. And then Mary joins in about 30 minutes into the conversation to talk about the upcoming comic they're working on together on Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, the author of Frankenstein. I was so excited to get Bryan and Mary on the pod because if you guys have been watching the channel for a while, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of both of theirs. Bryan's comic, Alice in Sunderland, I recently put on my top 5 comic books of all time, the list I did with Owen from Owen Likes Comics. And so it was just such a pleasure to get them on the pod and pick their brains about their creative process. There was also a bit of added personal significance as well for me to get Bryan and Mary on the podcast because an old friend of mine, Russell Wall, who sadly is no longer with us, actually directed what is now held up to be the definitive doc on Bryan and his work, The Graphic Novel Man, which is really, really good if you haven't heard of it. And you should definitely check it out. And so there was just a bit more personal significance for me in terms of just getting Bryan and Mary on the pod and talking to them about what they do. So without further ado, let's roll on my conversation with Bryan and Mary Talbot. Enjoy. Hi Bryan, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Okay, hi Billy. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure, sir. My pleasure. I've been a fan of yours for years and years. Really since I was a kid. Since I first read Alice in Sunderland, which is, one of my favorite comics. And I'm a huge fan of all the comics that you've done over your career, from Grandville and One Bad Rat. And we've got you on today to talk about your latest comic, which I have here, which is here we go. Here's my copy that I picked up from the other night from the launch party that you had at the Cartoon Museum. The Casebook of Stamford Hawksmoor. I read it over the weekend. It's fantastic. I loved it. To give a brief idea of it, it's a prequel to your series of comics, the Grandville series. You could describe it as a sort of hybrid of Rupert the Bear and kind of Quentin Tarantino with a steampunk kind of style. It's the sort of action detective comic series set in a kind of alternative steampunk universe where the French kind of conquered Britain and rule Europe. And as I say, this is Stamford Hawksmoor is a prequel to that series, featuring this kind of Sherlock Holmes-esque character of Stamford Hawksmoor. And I guess for a kickoff, when did you realise that you wanted to do a prequel to Grandville? Because Grandville, you wrapped up Grandville a number of years ago. When did you realise you knew you wanted to go back to that world?
Yeah, it was 2018, I think, when the last one came out. Only a couple of years ago, well, about three years ago, while I was working on this biography of me, it was being written by J.D. Herlock, and I would join him because there's a lot of stuff he couldn't find through interviews and articles and things. So I was sort of partly writing it with him. And we were doing a bit we did it all by email over a year or two. We were talking about Grandville. And he said, have you any ideas for future stories? And I said, well, I did have quite a few. But I decided to finish Grandville on the 5th one, which I thought was the most strongest story. And, in the 5th one, we meet LeBroc's mentor for the first time, Stamford Hawksmoor, who is this sort of Sherlock Holmesian type thing with a deerstalker on and smokes a meerschaum pipe and everything. Somehow this idea of a prequel got floated about with, about what was he like when he was a detective. I mentioned it to a couple of people, including Kate Charlesworth, who worked with on Sally Heathcote's Suffragette. And she even said, you should call it the Casebook of Stamford Hawksmoor, which is a reference to the last Sherlock Holmes collection of short stories, Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. So I'd started thinking about it, and it sort of developed from then. And I thought, I didn't want to do Grandville again, so it's not LeBroc's story, and I wanted it to be quite different. So, the Grandville stories are set in an imaginary Belle Epoque steampunk sort of universe with lots of Art Nouveau and Edwardian clothes and things. So this is set on the last day of the French occupation of Britain. It ends on Independence Day. It's not Art Deco, Art Nouveau, it's not Belle Epoque. It's not even steampunk as much. It's before the steam revolution. So it's very, very, very Victorian, with sort of hansom cabs and, foggy cobble streets and all this. It's all set in London, as opposed to the others, which are all set partially. They were all set in Paris. Another big difference is that all the Grandville books were computer coloured. I coloured them on computer. It just took a long time, a full day a page at least. This fully digital painted colouring. But the Hawksmoor books, I did them all in watercolour. So they're all done in watercolour washes, fine line with a watercolour wash, which I tinted sepia on computer. The idea being they look more like a Victorian photograph or something. So to accentuate this difference, so it's sort of monochrome, it's sepia. The watercolour gives a different texture, it's more sort of hazy and cloudy and everything. A lot of people say they prefer it, actually, especially the French readers. The French publication's doing very well. That came out earlier, it came in September. And it did quite well, the Grandville books in France, but a lot of French readers really hate computer colouring. So when this came out, it's getting rave reviews, it's every single review I've read is fantastic. Yeah, another big difference is that there's no text in Grandville books. All the text is spoken word. It's all in speech balloons. Whereas in the Hawksmoor book, it's the Casebook of Stamford Hawksmoor. He's narrating it, so there are lots of text boxes, all narrated in this, exaggerated sort of Victorian style. Did you enjoy that sort of bit when you were reading it? That aspect?
I did. I loved it, and having recently reread the Grandville books for this interview, and some of your other work as well, rereading it, revisiting it, and then going from Grandville straight into Stamford Hawksmoor, I was really struck by how marked the difference is, not just in the visual style, as you say. You talk about how Hawksmoor is watercolor and it's sepia, and Grandville is this quite kinetic, digitally coloured, very vibrant kind of, these action romps, and the sort of the difference in tone and sort of pacing. No, I really enjoyed it. I loved the sort of the approximation you did of the Conan Doyle, the prose style and the captions, and it's interesting reading it, and as someone who is a fan of comics, and as you're reading it, you're aware of how that slows down your reading pace because you're absorbing that text. But when the prose is great, like it is in Stamford Hawksmoor, you really like being sort of gently sort of taken deeper and deeper into that story. Did that sort of, I guess, going from Grandville to that, that sort of I guess in Grandville, like I say, kind of more sort of kinetic, sort of, I guess, overtly cinematic comic book style, going from that to Hawksmoor, where with this sort of more Victorian sepia style, did that present any challenges?
No, not really, no. I just chose a different approach, which I do. I've always done that on every book I've done. I've always let the story dictate the style of the illustration, because the style of illustration can't be the same for each story. Everything has to bend towards the storytelling, including the style you tell the story in. The art style has to be totally suitable and to the story, and has to accentuate it. And that's what I've always tried to do. And I didn't go straight from Grandville to that. In the meanwhile, I did the Legend of Luther Arkwright, which is like the third and final Arkwright story, which is, I did it 20 years after the last one. And that was quite long. It was well over 200 pages long, on this intense cross-hatching style. And I also did Mary's last book, the Armed with Madness, which was a biography of Leonora Carrington, the last surviving surrealist artist.
Yeah, and is it true that with Hawksmoor, you mentioned in your sort of introduction to the edition that the opening, which is this sort of this kind of key character commits suicide on the sort of the beautiful Suffolk fields. You mentioned in the introduction that you had the idea for that sort of opening sequence like something like 40 years ago, and is that true? Or are you on a train? Is that right? You're on a train through Suffolk and you have the idea?
Absolutely. I was doing it was either 88 or 89, because I did an Arkwright tour both years, I think, and I went all around the country doing signings. Different comic stores. During that tour, I was the first English artist to do a signing in Northern Ireland during the Troubles in Belfast. which was really scary. It goes all these checkpoints and stuff in the middle of the town centre and crazy stuff. But yeah, I went to Suffolk for the first time, to this comic shop called Ace Comics, which I can't remember what they stood for there. It was like American comic, something or other. Emporium, perhaps it was. Looking out the train window, these endless flat fields that had been recently ploughed. And I'd got the image, which is basically the opening scene of the Hawksmoor book. And it stayed with me, you know. The only difference was that instead of a wind-up cylinder player in Hawksmoor, it was a Walkman, which was popular at the time. You know, the ones you put cassette in. That was the only difference. And, of course, modern clothing in the original idea. But I always thought, well, that's a great opening for a story. And I never used it, but I never forgot it. So when I started writing Hawksmoor, I suddenly, thinking about the story, I thought, this is it. This is where I can use that thing. That idea I had. Quite visually striking, you know, these open skies, you know, you get big wide open skies, big flat fields.
Yeah, it's a terrific opening. And so you say you had that idea for a lot of sort of knocking about in the back of your head for best part of 40 years. I mean, when you were sort of putting together some of the comics you've done in those 40 years, like I guess maybe One Bad Rat or some of the Grandville stories or some of your works with Mary, were you thinking, oh, maybe that opening could go here? Or were you thinking, no, I'll save it? Or were you trying it with each one?
Yeah, each one it occurred to me that could start. No, it wouldn't suit this story. It wouldn't suit that sort of story.
Sticking with the introduction to the book, because Phillip Pullman, who's obviously an incredible writer himself, you know, did his Dark Materials. He provides the foreword to the comic. I mean, how did that come about? Was he a big fan of Grandville? Big fan of your comics?
Yeah, he's followed Grandville, I think, since the second one, and he gave there's a quote from him on the back cover of second or third one, I think. Originally touched them ages ago during somewhere around 2007, because I thought, you know, Leo Baxendale needs an OBE or something, you know. So I went through the process of suggesting him for an OBE, and we got the forms and everything. And I required letters of support from at least two other people who got the OBE. He supplied one, Lenny Henry, and Posey Simmons. He didn't get it, but the following year or something, because I used to see him quite a lot, you know. There's a guy from our childhood, the guy who invented the Bash Street Kids and Minnie the Minx, you know. He's one of my heroes when I was a kid. We got to know each other very well because he came from Preston where we were living 25 years, and he used to come up to visit his mother, and he used to stay at our house. About a year or two after this, I said to him, you know, you never heard from Buckingham Palace about anything, did you? And he said, oh yeah, last year I got an invitation to the party, you know, some garden party. And I said, did he go? He said, no, I told him to fuck off. And I thought, well, that's why he didn't get it, because he would have been invited to that. They were checking him out, you see. I don't know. And I knew it was anti-royalist and everything, but I thought it'd be worth it, him getting an OBE, because he could publicly turn it down, and it had advertised his books, because at that point he was self-publishing his own sort of prose books, and he'd written quite a few. At that point, he had his little company called Reaper Books, and I thought, well, at least he can get some publicity from it to help sell his books, but didn't happen.
Well, I guess his street cred, which obviously would have been very high, you know, for Bash Street Kids, only kind of went through the ceiling, I guess, after that. It reminds me of when David Bowie turned down a knighthood and people like Danny Boyle. So I think there's a kind of, you know, obviously, you know, if he wasn't a big fan of the royals, which tracks if he was, you know, Bash Street Kids, that kind of anarchy, you know, in his comics. Something I'm curious to ask about Stamford Hawksmoor, there's a moment in the book where you quote Samuel Johnson's famous quote, or rather the character of Stamford Hawksmoor quotes it. He says, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, and which is obviously such an iconic quote. And there's a real strong anti-hate sentiment, political sentiment in the comic, and also kind of anti-nationalist, because the context of the story is set, as you said at the start, is set against the backdrop of sort of British independence from France. And there's a lot of sort of, in the comic, there's a lot of xenophobia against the sort of totalitarian French, I guess, in the world of the story. And as I was reading it, a lot of that sentiment was chiming with me for right now. I mean, the world outside, you know, our window, it's, you know, the Britain outside our window. There's, as we know there's a lot of nationalism seems to be back on the rise, and reform seems to be on the rise. And I guess with the comic and with that particular quote from Samuel Johnson, were you hoping to comment as much on on today and the politics of today as you were in the context of the story?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think it's all tinged with like post-Brexit sadness, the whole story. But yeah, they're going to believe in this biggest empire in the world and all the trade links and everything. And everybody knows by now, Brexit's been a total disaster. How much did it cost us so far? £100 billion, or is it 2 billion a year, something like that? And it still is costing us money. But yeah, it is anti-nationalistic. So is the Arkwright story, if you've read that, the legend of Luther Arkwright. But yeah, and he explains Johnson's quote. He doesn't mean true patriotism. He means patriotism, and it's used to excuse the worst excesses of what you believe in, to push your own agenda. It's not, Farage and that. He's using patriotism extremely cynically. And so are these newspapers, Mail, Telegraph, Sun, outrage sells newspapers, and they're using this nationalistic thing, stirring it up because they know it'll get the readers hopping mad and they keep buying newspapers. But I was really very sad because I grew up during I was a teenager in the 60s, and there's a whole different atmosphere and different vibe. And it was actually cool to be nice, for once. It was uncool to be violent. There was a TV series during the 60s, which you probably heard of later, All in the Family. Oh no, that was the American title, wasn't it? No, Till Death Do Us Part. It was about his family. There was a guy in it who's called Alf Garnett, who's this mean-spirited, small-minded, nationalistic bigot. He's a Tory, basically. He's a working-class Tory, which was a ludicrous thing to be then in the 60s. And he was a national figure of fun. He was a laughingstock. People used to switch on to watch Till Death Do Us Part to laugh at him because he was so ludicrous, this character. And then since then, the whole country seems to have become Alf Garnett. They've been slowly turning into Alf Garnett. It's actually become a lot worse. So you've got all these small-minded, mean-spirited assholes running around these days. It's terrible.
Yeah. What you said there about how it's almost cool, it was cool to be nice back in the day. And now I agree. I think it's actually the inverse is cool now. It's cool to be hateful. It's cool to be, or certainly as you say, it sells, and it gets people's attention, which it should be, it shouldn't be the case, but it is. And it's a great shame. And you feel that in the comic, in Stamford Hawksmoor, you feel like you say, it's a post-Brexit comic. You feel that it's a very melancholy book in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously it's very spirited. At the same time, it's very, it's engaging, it's fun. There's action in it, there's mystery, but also there's a very very melancholy tone to it as well. And was that how you were feeling, and you just wanted to just put it into the comic?
Yeah, I mean, the Grandville ones, they're quite light-hearted romps. I know there's lots of killing in them and bombing and stuff like that. But I mean, they're adventure romps basically with some good detective work. But yeah, I wanted the Hawksmoor one to be a bit more thoughtful, a bit more serious. I hope I wrote a really intriguing detective story.
Oh, you did? One of the things I was most impressed by it was how labyrinthine it gets. Because, I feel like any sort of classically great sort of Sherlock Holmes story, or I guess like a Dashiell Hammett, or, those kinds of mysteries where like the narrative gets so labyrinthine and sort of dense that you kind of, the sort of the lines between what's sort of fact and fiction, but also like who your enemies are, who your friends are, gets blurred. And you really get the sense of emotionally being just pulled into that Twilight Shades of Grey world that obviously Stamford is in. And he's kind of the only sort of figure, even though obviously he sort of crosses the line. There are times where he crosses the line in the comic. He sort of holds his own in that world.
One of the French reviews said it was an excellent adventure story, detective story, because he said it was the first one he'd ever read that didn't contain, a cliche, a MacGuffin, what Alfred Hitchcock used to call, the reason for the plot. Didn't have this little thing that people are searching for, or people are, well, it does have something people are searching for, actually, but it doesn't have a simple MacGuffin, It's not all about trying to stop a bomb exploding or a computer taking over the world or something like that.
Totally, yeah. And that's how it felt. Even though you do have a sort of MacGuffin in there, you don't think, when I was reading it, I wasn't thinking, it wasn't as simplistic as just, that's the device, that's the thing we need to get to get here. It felt totally organic with the story.
Yeah, and it sort of comes and goes, really, isn't it? It's not through the lens of the story.
Yeah. That political edge that we were talking about, your writing has always had that, I feel, like political edge. I mean, and that sense of sort of class awareness in Britain. I mean, going right back to Luther Arkwright, which you mentioned, which is held up by many as like the first graphic novel, or one of the first graphic novels, certainly in this country. And that's obviously has a political kind of anti-imperialist edge with like Heart of Empire, and then Alice in Sunderland has the sort of the psychogeography of Sunderland, and sort of the marrying the lowbrow of sort of working class culture, like the Carry On films, to sort of Lewis Carroll, perceived highbrow. And when you're writing a story, or crafting a comic, is that something that you do you have like a subject that politically that you think, okay, I want to tell a story about this, or does it just organically emerge as you go and it surprises you?
It comes out. I mean, all writers, whether they say it or not, they've all got some sort of political bias, or they've got some sort of ideology, which comes out in the writing. You can't help it if you're trying to tell a story that feels to you truthful. Arkwright was written, it was in the 70s, mid 70s to late 70s, which was seeing the rise of the far right for the first time since the Second World War, really. With the Thatcher government coming to power and the National Front marching on the streets openly, this openly fascist organisation marching on the streets. So, I mean, it came out of that, Arkwright, as well as just me wanted to tell an intelligent science fiction story. And a few years later, it came out, well, Alan Moore grew up same time, and it came out in V for Vendetta about 4 years later, the same sort of, fear of totalitarian state and everything. But as you say, it's back again now. I mean, it feels like living in Germany in the 1930s at the moment. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, so it is a frightening time. And in those comics that we mentioned, so Luther Arkwright and Stamford Hawksmoor and Grandville, the politics come through, and they're very much, it's coming from seems to me like your voice, which is obviously, you grew up in a working class community up in Lancashire, and post-war, and then it's that voice comes through in the comics, but you have, and a lot of those comics, like your biggest successes, like Luther Arkwright and Alice in Sunderland, they feel very much to me like sort of homegrown British sort of gems of comics. But then you have obviously worked for a lot of the big mainstream companies like DC Comics and in America in 2000 AD. How much interest do you have in that sort of world?
Almost none now. I did have at one point. I was reading to Marvel Comics when I was a teenager. Jack Kirby's still one of my favourite artists. Steve Ditko, people like this, and then during the 80s and 70s and 80s, DC and Marvel Comics doing some good things. Even back then, when I was creating Arkwright in the 70s, I wanted it to be very, very British, because not only were all adventure comics, it seemed at the time, both in America and in Britain. I mean, 2000 AD when it started, were actually aimed at the catchment area. They were aimed at 12 to 14-year-old boys. All adventure comics were on that level, apart from sort of occasional ones, like, we did Near Myths in the late 70s, which is where Arkwright first appeared. And then a bit later, Their Skin did Warrior, which has made Alan Moore's name very big. But they were all aimed at kids. Basically, up to the mid-80s when Alan did Watchmen and Frank Miller did Dark Knight. And then things influenced by that started coming out. But yeah, so I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to do with that. I don't want to do something adult, not for kids. That's about the time I stopped reading superhero comics and things like that in general, because you ended up with two guys hitting each other more or less for the story. But yeah, Alan made him interested again with his Swamp Thing work in Watchmen, and there were several interesting stories on them. But I don't know, I sort of tailed off reading them in the 90s. I was reading the Vertigo titles, which were very interesting at the time, like Sandman and Shade the Changing Man and things. I was one of the people who were headhunted by DC, which they were doing in the late 80s and 90s. Because they were saying, hey, these British guys can do it better than our people, And they used to have a big party every year, DC in London, where they invited all the British creators, and wined and dined us. Everything was great. I didn't actually go to the very first one, but the first one was at Savoy in London. All these artists are saying, why are they doing this? Because they've never had this kind of treatment from publishers before, they've always just been used. And here the publishers feeding them nice food and giving them free drinks and They all ended up getting completely slashed. And yeah, there were bodies found in the street outside later, totally unconscious because of alcohol. There was food being thrown about and everything. Yeah, it was legendary night, that. And I sort of missed it because I wasn't invited. I went along from the second one onwards. But,
Grant Morrison describes those sort of nights of sort of bringing the American publishers when they came over to London and sort of bringing them and the UK comic creators together as being kind of like almost kind of a bit shocking for the Americans a little bit, because British comic artists would arrive and they're sort of like with their piercings and tattoos and, you know, Ben Sherman jackets and like Chelsea boots, and they were kind of, it was quite a strong, you know, impression that they left on these quite, I guess, sort of straight-laced DC and Marvel comics editors and publishers. So sticking with the sort of creator-owned stuff that you've done, which is obviously fantastic. And I mean, this year, 2025, marks the 30th anniversary of your comic, The Tale of One Bad Rat, which I want to say, I heard an interview recently that you gave that it's your most successful comic, your most commercially successful, is that right?
Yeah, over the years, yeah, I think so. Even more so than Arkwright, I think, which has been published in quite a few countries. Bad Rat, I think I've lost count. I think it's up to about 18 countries by now. This year, in January, it came out in France for the second time. The first time it came out was in 98. And it was republished February, year before it came out again in Italy. And that's about the fifth different publisher it's had in Italy. But the French publisher, who I've been with for the last 3 years, Laurent Lerner, he's great. He's going to be publishing all my books. He's only did Bad Rat this year, but he's been publishing. He started publishing the Grandville books about 3 years ago, and he's been publishing one every, getting it translated, everything, publishing one every 6 months, which is great because he's been building up a momentum, you know. And they've had staggering good reviews. I don't know how much they've sold. I know it's reprinted them a few times, but they're not selling huge now. I mean, the big selling French BD albums, they sell 200,000 or something. They're not selling anywhere near those, but they've been growing the sales. But like I say, Hawksmoor came out in September. He's going to press this week on a second edition of it.
And with One Bad Rat, then, it's amazing to hear that it's been translated into all those different languages and, you know, different countries, because I guess there's something, I mean, why do you think that is? Because I guess there is something universal about the story, which is the story of kind of child abuse fused with the sort of the iconography of Beatrice Potter. I mean, yeah, why do you think that is, that it's so, I guess it's transcended so many different sort of language barriers?
It's not a genre story. And I designed it. I changed the whole style of artwork, and I completely designed this visual storytelling of it to be accessible to people who weren't used to reading comics, you know, people who didn't have that sort of acquired knowledge, a comic grammar that we have through reading comics, people who've never had. And indeed, I've had lots of people saying to me that was the first comic I ever read. And it's very straightforward, the storytelling. It's very easy to read. At the same time, being, I think, quite subtle, sophisticated, because, you know, with something like Arkwright, it was very, very experimental at the time, consciously experimental. I was trying to do all sorts of things with the form. But with Bad Rat, there's a lot of experimentation in it. But it's all under the surface. It should all be hidden. The reader shouldn't see it. And these are like subtle things like the placement of eye level, the way the eyes led through from one panel to the next, down through the page, everything down to the size of a pupil, or the size of the character on the page. You know, yeah, it's just quite a lot of experimentation I did on that sort of level. I carried over some of it into Heart of Empire, actually, but yeah.
But you kept it quite subtle. That's interesting, because we had Grant Morrison on the pod not too long ago, and they said that when it comes to structure for them, when they're writing a comic, you want to keep it quite subtle and implicit. You don't want to announce what you're doing in a sort of structural sense as a storyteller. Is that something that you kind of, a principle that sort of resonates with you too when you're crafting a comic?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I spend a lot of time on the structure before I start writing the script. Weeks sometimes, till I know it's rock solid, the structure and the story, until everything's foreshadowed at exactly the right moment. You know, there's enough information to help the reader get from here to there, and I do spend a lot of time on that sort of stuff. It was great seeing Grant at the Lakes Festival this time. I've not seen him for years, not seen him for 12 years, because I had the Edinburgh Book Festival about 12 or 13 years ago. He was interviewed on Saturday night. And after that hotel, we went and sat down together, had a good old chat. Because I've known Grant since he was 17. You know, we published his first comic strips when he was drawing them himself in Near Myths from 78. Yeah,
I remember that because I was up at the Lakes. That's where we first met, and I told you about the pod. I remember Grant saying he was doing a talk, and he was saying that seeing you do Luther Arkwright and seeing you sort of work in your studio was what made them realise comics not only can be done to a high level, but like, this can be done produced properly, professionally. And I guess I did want to ask, like, what are your memories of sort of like of being friends with Grant, and also of those Near Myths days when you were sort of getting Luther Arkwright started?
Yeah, it was published by Rob King at the Science Fiction Bookshop in Edinburgh. He decided to publish a comic. It was suggested by Graham Manley, the comic artist Graham Manley, who was one of his customers. He said, let's do a comic. And it was Graham who suggested to contact me to get me on to do the strip. I don't know how they got hold of Grant. I think they met him at a comic convention before it came out. But yeah, it was a bit of a collective, really, because we used to have these meetings before everyone, usually in Rob King's flat. That's the first time I met Grant, and he came along, and he was 17, and he was really timid. It's not like you think of a Grant Morrison. No, he wouldn't say boo to a goose. And we were all, the rest of us were about 10 years older than him. And we were all sat there, we had long hair, and we all sat around smoking dope and passing joint. And Grant used to sit in a corner like this, watching us. Because later on, he became worse than us, you know. But I won't talk about his drug-addicted habits. But no,
they're public record.
He was telling me he wrote a lot of some of his DC stories on acid. He'd take acid and write a lot. It was tripping. It was just lovely to see him again, you know, to spend some time with him. Yeah,
I'm sure. I saw Grant the following day, and they did look a little bit worse for wear. It sounded like it had been quite a high-spirited evening.
Yeah, well,
catching up into.
We're drinking quite a bit after that. But,
I think Grant even said at one point that like Rob King and the guys running Near Myths would be sort of smoking dope, and sort of like, you know, only a few issues of Near Myths I think got made. And Grant said that at one point that you had to sort of come in and take over the editing a little bit because work just wasn't getting done. Is that right? You had to come in and be like, right, okay, let's get this done, lads.
Yeah, and I also thought it needed to look more professional in the magazine. You know, it looked too amateurish to me. So I said, can I come in? Can I edit an issue? And he said, yeah, sure. So I had cartoonist Alex Wazinko, whose pen name was Bonk. He used to do cartoons and comic strips under the name Bonk, underground cartoonist. And he was a trained graphic designer like me. Well, I met him while I was at design college, graphic design college. So I had him redesign the logo and all the graphics for the pages. So they all had a house style, and it looked a lot more impressive after that. And I started commissioning stuff. I commissioned a strip from Trina Robbins, which we had in one issue. I commissioned a strip from Glenn Fabry for the sixth one, which would have been his first professional work had not Rob King run out of money and just done a bunk. He did a Moonlight Flit, owing his landlord lots of money. And he left all the Near Myths back in his flat, and along with the other junk, the landlord just threw it all on the skip. Yeah, that's why there's not many issues in Near Myths around. Yeah, so this issue, and Glenn never got paid for his strip, of course, because he just vanished. But I think he surfaced about 5 years later in Amsterdam or something. But this sixth issue never came out because it was really starting to look good, you know. And we had national distribution. You know, we were sold all over the country in shops, newsagents and shops all over the country. It's very... Yeah, because, I mean, it's something that people can't do. It's so hard to get a comic published these days. Because to get the distribution now, you have to pay Smiths and Menzies and people like that. You have to pay them thousands of pounds.
Hey, Mary.
You have to pay them thousands of pounds to distribute your comic. Really, you know, to get it in the shops, you have to pay them, which is ludicrous. At the time, there's lots of little independent distributors all over Britain. They'd take anything as long as it was published. And they'd just take money for what they sold. And return the rest. It's a great situation. It meant there were copies of Brainstorm, the first comic, and Near Myths in every newsagent's practically in the country, you know, all around the country. It was great. Don't have that. Anyway, Mary's just joined us. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me.
You're welcome to Half the Pod as well, Mary. I mean, I've been a fan of the comics that both of you have been working on for so many years. So, since I was a teenager, since you guys first put out Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, which I love. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the pod too. I wanted to ask about the next comic that you guys are working on. I understand that you guys are working on a new comic. Is that right?
Yes, it's another biography, another graphic biography, this time set in the 18th century, about one of the first feminists, well, what we now call feminism. She was a writer. I'm really interested in finding out more for my own interest about fascinating, powerful women in history that I think other people will be interested and want to know about as well. Mary Wollstonecraft is, well, in some circles, extremely well known. Not for everybody, of course, but for some people, she's known as being the mother of Mary Shelley, who is the writer of Frankenstein. But for other people, she's well known in her own right as a writer for the writing The Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792.
Oh, wow, that's great. And so, Bryan, are you in the process of drawing that right now? Is it all, Mary, have you written it all up? Is it, what's the status?
I'm working from Mary's script right now. I'm up to about page 80, I think. 140 pages altogether.
Just under that of artwork pages, but then I'm currently working on annotations, and I don't know quite how much space they'll take up. When you're writing about a historical figure and an entire life, you can't fit everything into a comic, and a great deal has to be edited, like one scene representing many scenes, and so on, So I'm now going through looking at where I can enhance a particular aspect of the story with a little note for people to read afterwards.
Wonderful. Yeah, because I mean, I love how, one of the things I love about the comics that you've produced on your own, Bryan, but also the comics that you guys have produced together, like, I like Daughter of Her Father's Eyes and Sally Heathcote's Suffragette, is how rich and textured they are. Like, it's obvious that you guys really do your research, and like that comes through the annotations at the back of the books, but just in the general sort of, the texture of the stories. And with Mary Wollstonecraft, I mean, I guess, what was it specifically that attracted you guys to that story?
Lots of things. I mean, the period is fascinating in terms of early print culture. So I thought visually it would look really interesting. There's lots of cartoonists around, of course. Mainly, it was Mary Wollstonecraft herself, because what an important figure she is for the beginnings of feminism. And it was that I wanted to explore. There's a lot about her life I had no idea. She kept falling in love, and she had lots of difficulties with her family and so on, some of which I've included and some of which I haven't, because it gets tedious after a while. But yeah, she's just intriguing. She's just an intriguing person.
She knew everybody, anybody at the time, she's a good friend of William Blake's, who actually illustrated some of her books. She met Samuel Johnson, but
she met Samuel
she
Johnson
knew
briefly.
Fuseli, the painter, and Fuseli very well. Met Wordsworth, Coleridge.
They were fanboys.
Yeah, they were friends of hers. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then one of the things that you're so gifted at, Bryan, is like, I guess, the variances in your style as an artist. I mean, like, I think back to Alice in Sunderland and how you seem to cycle through like 7 or 8 different styles in the course of that comic at least, and it's fantastic. And with the books you guys have worked on together, there is that variance in style and like the materials that you're using. And I mean, you mentioned Blake. I mean, do you do a similar thing with this one? Is that style are you going to be working with, or any sort of other styles?
There's references to Blake in the artwork here, but yeah, it's all watercolor. Even the line work, it's not ink work, it's actually black watercolor with a fine brush. So, and I'm not used a ruler in any of it. So it's all hand done, so some of it's a bit shaky, but I wanted to give that sort of completely, that raw sort of look. It's nothing to do with the computer about it. I did the lettering on computer.
Very distinctively different. I think I've been having quite a time making all the people they've not got wigs on, but they've all got the same sort of hair. And they all seem to have the same big noses as well.
Yeah, there's some little other men. Yeah. Portraits, Yeah.
Because, of course, we don't have photographic reference to go on.
Paintings of them.
Paintings, portraits is all there is to go on to make them look different.
But yeah, it's a good, the time of Gilray and Cruikshank and all these fantastic early cartoonist.
Also, the language is very distinctive, of course. They're talking 18th century English, which has a very, very different feel to it. It looks different in print as well. 18th century typefaces are another matter. I mean, we got a few of those just to give you the idea of it, but I don't think anyone would be able to read it if we had it like that all the time.
And so a question I've been curious to ask the two of you for years is about the I guess the working process you guys have, not only as as a couple but as collaborators, because is it I wonder, is it the kind of situation where like Mary, you'll sit down, write the script, and then Bryan will be in his studio, and then you'll sit down at the kitchen table and go, okay, this is the story, and then Bryan will chip in with ideas, or what? How do you guys work? What's your collaborative process?
More or less that, yes.
I mean, bear in mind we're living together, so we're talking about it at the dinner table every night, and I suggest things. I've suggested scenes. I'll suggest. I'll be sort of a first editor, really. I'll say, these two balloons here, I think this could be one balloon, or the other way around. I think this sentence need to be clearer. I do make suggestions like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a full script with all the page breakdowns, panel by panel. But then sometimes Bryan can see a way to work better, or thinks I've maybe not included enough panels in to get a particular scene across. Things like that all the time.
Yeah, with Daughter, is Mary, the script was more like a stage play.
Yeah.
The scene description and characters. And the lines, and I broke it down into pages and panels and things. But right from, she's got the hang of it, and from Sally Heathcote Suffragette, it was right, page 1, panel 1, proper comic script.
Talking about the language, I mean, I suppose I'm that deeply immersed in it all. I'll think something makes perfect sense, and Bryan will say, "What the hell's that?" You have to paraphrase that a little bit. No, but that's her actual words. But yeah, there's a lot of that.
There's a lot of, I suggest things. I mean, Sally Heathcote Suffragette, I suggested also the framing sequence, of the nursing home. And other things like that. I think I suggested it for Red Virgin as well, didn't I? The thing with the Resholt of the guy jumping off the Eiffel Tower,
Which is hilarious in a really dark way.
I told him about that. I said, but I can't possibly fit it in. He said, yes, you can. But you suggested the framing device for this as well. I had it starting off.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
When she's in Palace of Versailles after it's been sacked. And she writes about it, and I'm quoting her from that, and which is a lovely sombre way to start, to sort of right into the thick of things in the middle of revolution.
And then Mary said that the memorials in London, St Pancras, in St Pancras churchyard, and I thought, well, it'd be good to get that in it. And she said, well, it can't. It's all in the 18th century. So I suggested this scene where it starts off with these. Just 2 pages. It's a woman and a daughter walking past St Pancras and going up to the churchyard and looking at the memorial. The last page, they're walking away from it, and that's in colour. That's the only bit that's in full. 2 bits are in full colour. The rest of it's in different tint. There's some brown, some reddish, some blue.
So we go from a very distinctive to present day St Pancras in the middle of London to the 18th century.
What day is it? We were there. We're back there on Friday, actually. Just take a couple of more reference pictures. Yeah.
So it sounds like it's as a sort of story of her life. It's very much it's birth to death, because I think there's something that some people don't know is that she died very soon after Mary Shelley, her daughter, was born. That's right, isn't it? 11 days?
10 days after.
10 days, which is, unbelievable. So it's kind of, that's the sort of structure you guys have gone for, is kind of the sort of the birth to death, kind of, and as much as you can get in reasonably in the middle, I'm guessing.
Well, it used to be quite insanitary in those days, and it's basically a result of her giving birth to where she died, She got infected. And the doctors not washing their hands and things like this. And,
specifically that.
Yeah.
And what you say there about your sort of working process you guys have together then, because like I say, you guys have produced, I think this is the 5th or 6th comic you've produced together. 6, including Rain. And over those 6 comics, do you feel like you guys have developed a shorthand? But at this point, you have it sort of down, I guess, the process you have of sort of writing and then Bryan taking over the illustration?
Yeah, probably. Really.
Probably, yeah. Of course, each story has been very different and has different requirements. But I mean, I know I can rely on Brian's store of knowledge of artistic forms, for example, with the Armed with Madness. I mean, I knew that he would recognise, he'd be familiar with a lot of the artists that I was referencing. And some rather strange directions in panels in that one, didn't we?
Oh, yeah. Because it's surrealist, lots of realistic scenes in it, being about a surrealist.
They were driving through a brodal landscape under a
Guernica sky.
Guernica sky.
That was a
Perfectly clear. You knew exactly what I meant.
But in one panel, in Dotter, Mary actually drew the bit where she's. It's one page that symbolises several years that Lucia Joyce spent in institutions, and she said rather than do year after year of it dragging on like this, in institutions for decades, she summarised it in one page, and she dreamt this image of Lucia Joyce dancing frenetically, wearing a straitjacket and flailing about, with images of her behind bars in a spiral going into the distance behind her. Whereas the page after it was originally 6 panels.
That's right.
And they're talking about the Nazis marching into Paris and these things happening. Her last days being spent wandering the streets of Dublin, like not last days, but her last days before she was put in an asylum, like a bag lady almost. And I thought, well, that's the last time we see her. It'd be good to go off on a strong image. So I just used one image of her on the streets, and we just kept the text from the rest of the pages because they didn't need to be drawn. You can read the Nazis marching into Paris and imagine them marching into Paris, and you don't need to actually physically show it. And in fact, the worst sort of comic writing is the ones where they'll have a description of what's happening, then they'll have the same thing only drawn in the panel underneath. Yeah, we got away with it by having a nice strong image on the Dublin street in the middle of Dublin. I can't remember its name, George's Street.
O'Connell Street.
O'Connell Street, yeah. And the text just round the edge, describing what's led her here, and hinting what's coming after. That sort of thing you can do with comics, words and pictures and like that.
Yeah, bad comic writing would be sort of showing and telling, whereas like I guess what you're describing is a kind of like, but knowing when to tell or knowing when just to show, just to illustrate.
Yep.
Yeah.
In contrast with doing a lecture, for example, it's a good thing to both show and tell.
Yeah. Eric Zula, Eric Zula's work. He did Puma Blues, and I think he worked with Neil Gaiman on several things. He had to draw a Tarzan story, and he got to this panel, and it said in the caption, Tarzan falls into a trap. And the picture, it's Tarzan. It's actually Tarzan falling into a trap, these things with spikes at the bottom. A speech balloon coming from Tarzan. Help, I'm falling into a trap. That's just really bad writing.
As collaborators, the two of you, I mean, what do you think each of you has sort of learned from the other in terms of what you're doing with these comics? I mean, in terms of the writing, but obviously the storytelling. I mean, what you just described there, is such a brilliant example of how comic storytelling can work at its best. I mean, what do you think the two of you have learned from the other over the last 13 years that you've been making comics together?
I'm not sure, because it's been a very organic process, isn't it? It's working together, because you've been together for 50 odd years now. So it's just like everyday life, really. It's just like a continuation of every day.
It's been very enjoyable. I don't know what we've learned from it, but it's enjoyable because we're working on projects together rather than working in parallel on totally different things. We've been, in step, doing things together. It's a positive.
Yeah, after working in two different worlds for most of it, working on projects together has been great, and we've enjoyed it.
And when we were talking the other night at the Cartoon Museum at the launch party for Stamford Hawksmoor, and also up in Leicaf at the Lakes, I want to say you said that, so with the Mary Wollstonecraft graphic novel that you guys are working on, is it still in the sort of the trying to get interest from a publisher stage, or is someone sort of snapped it up ready to go?
No, we're waiting for the contract now from Self-Made Hero.
Tweaking the contract at the moment.
You did our last book. It's taken a long time. It's 80 pages for no money, so that's a year's work. So not being paid anything yet.
Wow. And how come you gone for a Self-Made Hero? Because I want to say that, like, so Dotter and Sally Heathcote and Red Virgin, I want to say they were Jonathan Cape, like the Grandville books. I mean, were they simply not interested, or were they, was there no sort of availability for them, or What was the
It's
reason?
not that, it's just that they've cut down. They used to do quite a lot of graphic novels and they've cut them down to just a handful a year now.
It's also down to change in staff, change in people. People have different priorities. I think they've got someone in charge again now who's keen on graphic novels. So I was talking to Dan Franklin, who is our editor, last week, and he says they're producing more now. They weren't interested in Mary Wollstonecraft, put it that way, when we offered it.
Yeah,
Quite some time ago now.
So it sounds almost like it's whoever's in charge who's interested in graphic novels will be like, yeah, let's do it. Or if they're not, then it's almost down to the winds of fate a little bit. Is that fair to say?
For years we had Dan Franklin. He was my editor on all the Grandville books and Alice and lots of things. I don't know, the first 3-4 books.
Yeah, Dan Franklin's always been a champion of graphic novels.
Yeah, and he's retired. He's still a consultant. But he's sort of retired. He can't do that. He can't just say, okay, we'll publish this book now, which he used to be able to do. Yeah, it was one of my claims to fame, that having the same editor as Salman Rushdie,
That is a claim to fame. With Stamford Hawksmoor and then the Mary Wollstonecraft project, I mean, it seems to me that for creators both your ages, I mean, you seem to have no sign of slowing down. Like, you haven't stopped producing great work for years. I mean, but although I want to say I heard in a recent interview that Stamford Hawksmoor and then the Mary Wollstonecraft comic may well be the last graphic novels you guys do. Is that right? And I'm hoping it's not, but as a fan. But
I don't know. Well, I've been writing Stamford Hawksmoor short stories, and I quite like the idea of getting them out in comic form at first, which I've not done for years. But if not, if I manage to do 2 or 3, then they can come out in a book. They can come out in one book.
They're not that short, though, are they?
Well, the shortest is 25 pages.
Oh, no, okay.
That's the shortest. The second one I wrote is about 60 pages. So I probably can do that in 2 halves,
But we don't have any plans to do another one together.
You're not currently researching anybody?
I'm trying. I'm looking for people, but I haven't found anyone that I could stand to live with, as it were, for 2 years. The time that it would take to work on. I was keen on doing something on Alice Guy, and just as I started reading up on Alice Guy.
First woman filmmaker, yeah.
She was working on film in the 1880s for what became Gold. Yeah, I mean, I was just, when I found out about her, I thought, wow, this is incredible. Shortly afterwards, this book came out by Cattle and Bonnie.
2 people. It's what's the first name?
I can't remember the first name.
They do sort of Cattle and Bocal, is it? Bokeh. Yeah. She writes, he writes it and she draws it.
Yeah, I confess I haven't heard of her. And speaking as someone who's, a film fan, like I feel kind of slightly ashamed that I haven't heard of her. I mean, it sounds like was she quite an important sort of female filmmaker back at the sort of the birth of film?
Yeah, exactly.
She was, yeah. I mean, they were very short things, as you can imagine. She did one which was The Fairy in the Cabbage Patch or something. It was about where babies come from.
About 5 minutes long, yeah. We were in happened to be Lille quite a few years ago, an exhibition, exhibition on, and they were showing the film. But she eventually, I think she moved to America.
In the
for a bit in Shadow Studios
film company in the States.
In Hollywood,
I don't think it was Hollywood.
Was it not? No, it was in New York. It was on the coast, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was a rival to Hollywood.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, because I guess normally when you hear those sort of figures of early cinema in France, you think of like Georges Méliès or the Lumière brothers. I mean, who are men, and I guess you don't. I know, like I say, I confess I hadn't heard of her, so I'll have to check her out. So that could be a potential project there.
Well, as I say, somebody's done it already.
Yes, we can.
Oh, as a comic. Sorry.
Yes, a graphic novel. Yeah. Kiki de Montparnasse is very good. You should check it out, and Josephine Baker as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. So recently we had a comic book YouTuber on who's sort of essayist and historian called Owen Likes Comics, and we recently did our top 5 favourite comics. And one of my top 5 picks was actually Alice in Sunderland, which I'm a huge fan of, and which you both feature in quite predominantly. Like you're both. There's multiple scenes where like Brian's writing the comic, and Mary, you're there as well, and at the Sunderland Empire there's that framing device.
Just a walk-on part.
Well, I wanted to to ask, like, I know Sunderland is your sort of both your adopted home. I mean, what's the relationship you guys have to that comic now, and I guess broader to the sort of city of Sunderland? Because it really is like, I can't think of many other works which kind of are such a celebration of that city. You know, it's a wonderful celebration. I guess, what's your relationship to that comic now that it's been nearly 20 years since you did it?
I don't know. Well, a lot of people in Sunderland have heard of it. You know, sometimes I can talk to somebody in a shop or something like this, or a workman, and they'll say, "What do you do?" You know, very often they come here and see my studio. They go, "What are you doing in there?" You know. I said, "I do comics." They go, "Oh yeah." I said, "Have you heard of Alice in Sunderland?" They go, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that." Yeah, because is it at the times in old papers, local papers? It was on local TV.
Unfortunately, it's out of
print. I mean, yeah.
So that's a print.
Oh yes, it sold very well. I mean, it went into 5 reprints. I think the Cape edition sold over 20,000 in the first year. The local Waterstones in the middle of Sunderland sold 1,000 copies. So yeah,
but it's the sort of thing that would keep on selling in Sunderland. Would keep on selling indefinitely.
Yeah.
Probably not everywhere. In Sunderland, clearly.
They kept them in the local museum till it stopped. So it went into print.
That's such a great shame that it's out of print, because I mean, because I understand that, like, obviously in Sunderland is popular, but like, I mean, just for me reading, I mean, I'm from Sheffield. I mean, as a northerner reading it, obviously there's so much sort of northern soul in it, but also in terms of just the spirit of the North, but also just like, you seemed like you were sort of encapsulating everything in one comic. Like, obviously there was Carol and Sunderland and the Mackham culture, but also kind of life and death and like change, and like you were swinging at so many of the huge sort of themes, I guess, that like of just literature really in that project. And it's one of the reasons why I love it, and why I included it on that list, because it was just and I felt like giving it, you know, and it's such a shame that it's not in print anymore. It needs, you know, that's such a shame.
Yeah. There's an American edition that saw two printings from Dark Horse, and a Spanish edition, an Italian one as well. I'm surprised they'd be interested in Sunderland, you know. Can't get a French edition. But French publisher says it's just too British. French people wouldn't be buying it.
Because one of the things that felt like you were doing in that comic is sort of like planting the flag down in Sunderland and saying like, and it's almost like a potted history of England through the lens of one town of Sunderland. And it reminded me a little bit of what Alan Moore would do later with Jerusalem, his novel about Northampton. It's like, it's kind of a potted history. It's like, you know, sunk in the town of Northampton, you have the kind of history of Britain. And it's like, but you were doing it in graphic novel form years earlier with Alice Sunderland. It's fascinating, 2 different, you know, Northampton and Sunderland, you know, it's 2, you know, obviously great towns.
It inspired 2 books came out of it, directly inspired by it.
One of them's about Brighton.
Yeah, Brighton. The Bristol story was in
the Bristol.
Yeah, the romance novels.
Yeah.
It's like the Brighton one. I did. They even got me to do the introduction and the cover. So
that's right.
Well, didn't the Sunderland Council get you to design is it the queue line, the sort of that goes through Sunderland, which is the sort of is the pictorial history of Sunderland? But was that based off Alice in Sunderland?
Well, I didn't have to research it because I've done all the research for Alice. No, the local council. I just saw the local council. There was a new city square we've had because there was a big brewery that took up most of it, right in the centre of Sunderland, and that closed down, the Vaux Brewery, 20 odd years ago. And this whole new, it's never had a proper big city square, so we've got one now. We've got this thing called Kiel Square. There were a lot of connections with the shipping industry, you know, because it used to be the biggest shipbuilding port in the world, Sunderland, mid-19th century. Yeah, and they were putting out a tender saying, you know, for people to design this keel line, 223 yard long, I can't remember, it's very long, strip of black granite paving stones that go straight across the keel line. And it's actually only this year they've laid the last part of it. I thought, I've got to put in for this tender. I've got to see if I can get it, because if I don't, I'm going to be walking past this. Every time I walk past, I'm going to say, I could have done something better than that, you know, designed something better than that. So I put this tender in and then forgot about it, you know, with some sample panels and sample stones and things, sort of designs. And I actually won the tender. I was against these big design studios he put in for it. So, yeah, what they wanted was this strip of paving stones with all the names of the ships that had been built on the weir, and there's hundreds of them. After I'd won the tender and I went in for a meeting at the chief architect's office to talk about it, he showed me the other designs that had been put forward. And I could instantly see why mine won. All the rest was boring.
the only one with pictures in.
Yeah, mine was with them all pictures. Those all look like war memorials, you know. And mine, I didn't choose a, you know, a classic face like Times. I chose a big chunky sans serif face, which looked quite nice. I also added a few paving stones at the beginning of the line on the side with two coils of rope, asymmetrical coils of rope that come together, then cross over like that, and then form a border that runs the entire length. And I think it's every 23 paving stones, they cross over like this. And in the triangles that they form, this rope design, there's an illustration chronologically telling the history of Sunderland as it goes along the line. So yeah, mine was more visually interesting, I think. That's why it won.
And it's his granite comic.
Yeah, it's a granite comic.
Arguably got to be perhaps the only granite comic in history. Is that fair to say?
Trajan's Column, yes, Scott McCloud called a comic strip, but it's nothing granite in it. But
that's fantastic. Well, I mean, I'm not surprised that you beat out the competition. I mean, if they were going up against the graphic novel man, so it didn't surprise me that you got won that.
What was nice, it's there's a Second World War sequence, everything. At one, I've got a picture showing a person who represented the different forces, RAF and the army and everything, and the sailor there's an ordinary seaman that's my dad. He didn't come from Sunderland, but he was in the Navy during the war. So, and I was quite pleased because I showed him that a year or two before he died. I said, "Look, yeah, he authorised in granite."
Oh, I bet he was right chuffed with that.
Yeah.
Aye. Wonderful. Well, this has been such a pleasure, guys. It's just such a pleasure to listen to you chat and to talk about, Stamford Hawksmoor, of course, and the upcoming Mary Wollstonecraft comic. And what can I say? I can't wait to see it when it comes out.
We're hoping the end of next year, but we don't
This
know.
time next year, if we're lucky.
Oh no, won't be this time next year. Or perhaps it is the end of the year, isn't it?
It is the end of the year.
Wonderful. Well, and as I say, all I can say is, as a fan, I hope you guys, personally, I'm hoping that there'll be many more Bryan and Mary Talbot comics coming from you guys down the line. So, but that's just me being a fan. So,
Good to see you. Goodbye.
Yeah, pleasure to see you guys again. Pleasure to chat. Thanks again for coming on the pod.
See you, Billy.